We are thrilled and honored to have our own Margaret Perlman's granddaughter, Professor Wendy Perlman, return to us for another incredible lecture. Wendy is a professor and award-winning teacher at Northwestern University, specializing in Middle East politics. She was educated at Harvard, Georgetown, and Brown. So was I. I just made that up. Wendy speaks fluent Arabic and has more than 20 years studying and living in the Arab world. She's the author of numerous articles and 3 books, including Occupied Voices, Stories of Everyday Life from the Second Intifada, and Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian Movement. Her book, We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria, was published by Custom House this year in June of 2017. There will be a book signing afterwards, as you probably saw on my left over here. So for those of you who haven't purchased a book yet, you can do so, and those who have, you can ask Wendy to sign it. So let me go ahead and welcome Professor Perlman, and come on up. We welcome you. Thank you so much.
So yes, thank you so much. I'm a frequent visitor here in Laguna Woods Village, so it is a delight to be here and to be speaking to you all, because I know that I'm a fan of concerned citizens. It means so much to my grandmother, so it means a lot to me too. So otherwise, let's go ahead and get started then. So as was mentioned, I've been studying the Middle East for a long time. I began during a college semester abroad in 1995, and continued studying the Middle East and studying Arabic ever after that. So in 2011, when the uprisings began in Tunisia and then Egypt, what became known as the Arab Spring, like most regional specialists, I became captivated by these shows of people's power. And not just regional specialists, most people on the planet were captivated by millions of people throughout the Arab world going out into the streets, protesting authoritarian regimes, calling for change. And I really wanted to know how this happened, what pushed people to the streets, and most of all, what it felt like for those who protested for the first time, how it was transforming them as individuals. And I figured that in order to know this personal side of the story, what it was like to protest, that I couldn't stay a million miles above. I would have to zoom in and talk to people. There'd be no better way to know what it felt like to protest, what people wanted, than to go and to ask them and to collect their stories. So interested in that personal dimension of the Arab Spring, I became most interested in the case of Syria. So as we know, the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, then protests went on to Egypt. From there, protests spread to Yemen, to Bahrain, to Libya, and many people at the time said, Syrians, no way. They're too afraid. Assad's Syria is a kingdom of silence, was the expression used. Syrians are too intimidated, their regime is too strong, protests might go everywhere else, but Syrians will probably not protest. So when Syrians did go out and protest against all odds, against others' expectations, even against their own expectations, I really wanted to know what it was like and what brought them to the streets. Again, thinking there was no better way than to go and to interview them. And thus I began a long series of about 5 years of interviewing displaced Syrians. By 2012, summer was the first time I got my chance to begin traveling to talk to Syrians. By that time, it was already too dangerous to go inside Syria. At least it was too dangerous for me to talk to Syrians, going inside Syria, talking about politics and protests, getting people's frank stories. So I decided to collect the stories of those Syrians who had fled the country as refugees. At 2012, it was still a trickle. As we know now, it's a flooding of refugees out of Syria. I began in Jordan, then moved on to Turkey, eventually to Lebanon, to the United Arab Emirates, and then as there was the large wave of Syrian refugees, to Europe, I also went to Europe gathering the stories of Syrians, and I'm continuing on. Last summer I was also in Germany, and I will go back to Germany this summer, continuing to interview Syrian refugees. So while the people I interviewed varied by age, class, region, the overwhelming majority of people identified as being against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So these are people who supported the uprising, participated in the uprising, identified with it as a revolution. So the people I talked to in that sense no way represent the full spectrum of all Syrians, and especially the views of those who support the current regime. But at the same time, it represents a part of the population that I think meets with too few chances to represent itself, to discuss what the conflict means to them in their own words, in their own hearts. My interviews were open-ended. They could last from 1 hour to 5 hours. Sometimes they spiraled over days or over continents when I reconnected with the same person years later after he or she had perhaps moved on to a different country. And there are many people with whom I still remain in touch. And after collecting all of these different stories about what it means to be Syrian, I slowly saw how the individual narratives coalesced into a collective narrative, a shared Syrian revolutionary narrative. So I produced this book. Oops. Oh, no, I guess I don't have a picture of the book. The book is over there. I produced this book to express this narrative. It's an oral history of the Syrian conflict. The introduction is in my voice, providing some basic background about the Syrian conflict, and the rest is exclusively in the words of Syrians themselves. It's a curation of excerpts from these hundreds of interviews I did, designed to walk someone through the history of the conflict, from the origins of what life was like before the uprising, through the uprising's launch, escalation, militarization, to the war and refugee outflow that we have today. Some excerpts are short, some are long. They're personal, they're fragments, they're stories. Ordinary Syrians talking about what this conflict means through how they lived it and were transformed by it. So what I'd like to do today then is walk you through this historical arc, hoping to give you some sense of what the Syrian war is all about, and also what it has felt like, at least for a cross-section of Syrian and men and women. So we'll begin then in the beginning, authoritarianism. So in 1970, after decades of coups and instability, Hafez al-Assad seized power in Syria, the military general. There is much to say about how Hafez al-Assad fortified an authoritarian regime through the design of different institutions, different policies, different strategies. Everything from the military to the economy was designed to create coalitions to keep this authoritarian regime in power. There's much to say, much that can be said and has been written about the political science of that regime durability. But the stories that I collected say most of all what was the lived experience of Syrian citizens under a regime profoundly unfree. And these stories emphasize how a single ruling political party, an omnipresent security apparatus from secret police to the army, and a pervasive network of covert informants all combined to police society and encourage society to police itself. For many citizens, this was embodied in the collective memory surrounding the events of Hama in 1982. And this refers to how the regime faced various forms of armed and unarmed opposition from the late 1970s to the early 1980s, culminating in an insurrection by the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the most organized opposition force at the time. The Muslim Brotherhood retreated to the town of Hama and launched something of an insurrection in that town. The Assad regime sent in tanks, in troops, launched something of a scorched earth operation, killing tens of thousands of people, many of them civilians who had nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood or even were not even involved in politics. And this warned an entire generation of Syrians. This is what the regime will do to those who dare to challenge it. And I cannot emphasize enough how the memory of Hama, the kind of dark shadow of Hama, hung over Syrians for generations. To express that, hear the words of one young man I interviewed named Muhammad. And he said, Hafiz al-Assad tamed the Syrian people by using security and military rule. It was like when you have a wild animal that you want to make a pet. Syria became a big farm. For Syrians, life meant waking up every morning, going to work, and coming home at the end of the day. He killed political life. The regime not only used punishment or threat of punishment to gain obedience, it also used corruption and co-optation. To express that, hear the words of Iham, who would later go on to be a web developer, here recalling his childhood. And he said, the brainwashing process starts when you go to school. We love the leader, we love the regime. Without them, the country will collapse. You grow up with that in the back of your head, constantly reminding you that we are living due to the grace of the Assad family. But even as an innocent child, you could see that the whole system just reeked. It fed on corruption and grew. If you want to get a passport, you have to bribe this guy and that guy. From when you're little, you're taught that this is the only way to survive in this country. Everything is handled by how loyal you are to the regime. So you're raised on the principle that you have to show your loyalty. Bashar al-Assad came to power in the year 2000, and many believed that this young, educated head of state would make change. The father died, and the son took over. So many were extremely optimistic, and Bashar al-Assad presented himself as a reformer and a modernizer and a new face. And in many ways, there was change, chiefly in the realm of the economy and a shift from a state-dominated economy to a more neoliberal market economy, which in many ways allowed opportunities for corruption to grow as regime cronies got monopolies and exclusive contracts, and the poor in many ways grew poorer and poorer, watching state subsidies withdraw. So for many Syrians, their lives, economically speaking, got worse in the year 2000s, but the threat of punishment, should anyone dare to challenge the regime, remained. Here, Saleh, a landscaper, told me, we don't have a government, we have a mafia. And if you speak out against this, it's off with you to Beit Khaltu, your aunt's house. That's an expression we have. It means to take someone to prison. It means forget about this person. He'll be tortured. You'll never hear from him again. This feeling that if someone talked too much, they would disappear in some dungeon prison is best captured in the expression, hush, the walls have ears, which Syrians would tell me over and over again as a way of saying people were afraid even to speak in their own houses. Hush, the wall have ears. You don't know who might be spying on you. It could even be your brother or an uncle might turn you in to the police. And what I found, in the sense that spies could be everywhere, was hush, the wall have ears was not simply a form of rule. It could be a disposition to silence that was so internalized, maybe it even stayed with Syrians after they left the country. Here, Hossam, who left Syria as a child in the 1980s, described having contact with Syrians in the 90s, 2000s, when they left Syria. And he said, when you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences. Everything is okay, Syria is a great country, the economy is doing great. It'll take him like 6 months, up to a year, to become a normal human being, to say what he thinks, what he feels, and then he might start whispering. They won't speak loudly. It's too scary. After all that time, even outside Syria, you feel that someone is recording. For sure, there were transgressions. People stood up to power in ways that were large and small, and this changed and evolved over the years. And one example of people pushing the boundaries of political permissibility are these very cartoons by the Syrian cartoonist Ali Farzad, some of which were allowed to be printed inside Syria. And some analyze how the regime allowed some areas of contained permissible discontent, almost like a safety valve, to allow some people to express their dissatisfaction while keeping the lid on any real challenges to power. But for most of the people I interviewed, there was a sense that corruption and repression simply limited the horizons of possibility. To hope for change seemed foolish. To fight for change, reckless. It would probably only get you and maybe even your family in the worst kinds of trouble. As expressed by a drama student whose words are the first entry to my book, a Syrian citizen is just a number. Dreaming is not allowed. Until, of course, Syrians dared to dream. And I spend that time trying to create an atmosphere of what life was like in Syria from 1970 to 2011, so we can appreciate how really amazing it was that millions of Syrians eventually went out to the streets, called for freedom, called for dignity, called for change. So as we know, protests began elsewhere in the Arab world, and many Syrians themselves thought it would never happen in Syria. So the book describes the series of small events, how first tentative demonstrations eventually spread over space, were sustained over time, and launched a nationwide revolt. First calling only for reform of the current system, and eventually calling for change and the overthrow of the Assad regime. I'm happy to talk about that timeline or any part of it, but would like to share now some stories about what protest meant to those who participated in it, what it felt like. And I think the essence of that is captured in another expression that became ubiquitous in Syria, which is the barrier of fear broke. People were able to participate because they overcame the fear that had kept them trapped for so many years. And what comes through in people's stories is not that fear disappeared, but that people mustered the courage to work through fear, to work and protest despite fear. So to express that, let me share you the testimonial of Shireen, a mother in her mid-30s from the city of Aleppo. And she said, oppression was residing in us. It was part of our life, like air, sun, water. We didn't even feel it. Like the air is there, and you never ask, where is the air? And then, in 1 second, in one shout, in one voice, you blow it up. You defy it and stand in front of death. You have an inheritance, and after 30 years, you slam it on the ground and shatter it. Don't even imagine that it was easy to go out to a demonstration. No amount of courage allows you to just stand there and watch someone who has a gun and is about to kill you. But still, this incredible oppression made us go out. I encouraged my nieces and nephews to come with me to demonstrations. I felt that if they didn't try that experience, they'd be missing the real meaning of life. When you chant, you shudder and your body rises, and everything you imagine just comes out. Tears come down, tears of joy, because I broke the barrier. I am not afraid. I am a free being. Sadness and happiness and fear and courage, they're all mixed together in that voice, and it comes out strong. Before the revolution, Syria was just the place where I lived, but it didn't belong to me. When the revolution began, I discovered that Syria was my country. Does this sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Nearly everyone who participated in demonstrations identified with it as an experience that was not merely emotional, but transformative. I would ask people to describe their first demonstration. And what people said to me most frequently was, l'intoussif. It's simply indescribable. You can't put into words what it felt like. And I would say, okay, I'm writing a book here. I work in words. Try to describe it in words, what it felt like. And people would say things like, it was the first time I breathed. The first time I felt like a human being. The first time I felt like a Syrian citizen. One man said, it was better than my wedding day. And when my wife heard that, she refused to speak to me for a month. This sense that it was like the first time is for me best captured in the words of Rima, a writer from the city of Sweden, who said, I was in a demonstration and I started to whisper, freedom. And then I started to hear myself repeating, freedom, freedom, freedom. And then I started shouting, freedom. And I thought, this is the first time I have ever heard my own voice. And I told myself that I would never let anyone steal my voice again. This, I think, is what the Syrian uprising meant to those who participated in it, who championed it, who supported it. And I think it's important to remember, because as the Syrian story gets darker and darker, that memory of how it began is increasingly buried. Because as we know, that's not where the Syrian story ended. So the regime, the Bashar al-Assad regime, responded to largely peaceful protests with violence. The uprising remained predominantly nonviolent for the first 6 months. Increasingly towards the summer of 2011, the opposition took up arms. Those who did take up arms, who chose to join this increasingly armed rebellion, explain why. Here, a man who goes by the alias Captain, a young fighter from the city of Aleppo, explained his choice to take up arms. And what he told me was, when demonstrations began, the security forces came. We agreed that if they were going to shoot bullets, then we needed weapons too. We were only chanting in the streets. We could have chanted for the rest of our lives without anyone even paying attention to us. But when the regime started attacking us, a lot of people who were on the sidelines started to join and protest too, because of the blood. Blood is what moves people. Blood is the force of the revolution. As the armed rebellion expanded, the regime escalated its reprisals. Various state and non-state parties became involved. The full-fledged, multi-sided, brutal war that we see today ensued. And as part of this intervention of various outside parties was Al-Qaeda coming from Iraq, from which ISIS sprang forth, and all of the messiness of the Russian intervention, the Iranian intervention, and so forth, making this complicated war, which often seems bewildering. And I'd be happy to discuss the politics of the different actors and interests as well. But the book describes what the experience has been like for civilians living this war, caught in the crossfire. And what I find in civilians' experiences of war are what seem to me to be two contradictory experiences. On the one side, living war is terror. Ru'b is the word people would use in Arabic. People describe living under shelling and bombing. People often talked about how the sounds of war were as terrifying as the explosions themselves. Hearing planes buzzing overhead and not knowing when the bombs would fall or where they would fall. About families crouching in stairwells or in basements or in underground shelters, just hoping they would be okay, but also knowing there's nowhere to hide from often arbitrary aerial bombardment on civilian areas. So war is terror. But on the other hand, there's a kind of normalization of terror. People simply had to get used to living under war. War became like the air people breathe. There was no escape, and people got used to it. As people would say, it became normal. You had to feed your families, you had to go about doing business, and war became like the backdrop for everyday life. And there are a few different elements of this kind of normalization of the experience of civilians living war. One is in landscapes. We are all familiar with these pictures of rubble, of bodies, of neighborhoods turned to rock and stone, these once thriving civilian neighborhoods, businesses, homes, schools, turned to look like terrible bomb sites. What people also told me is that often families could not reach cemeteries in order to bury the dead. So people literally buried bodies wherever they could, in gardens, in backyards. One man said to me, someday the land will speak with the bodies buried underneath. And I don't know if any of you have heard the news of this recent art exhibit, which captures exactly that, of the bodies literally buried, so that the normal places of civilian life marked by death. Another aspect of this normalization of terror is in children. Oops, just gonna, make sure I can't really see. Is in children's experience. How children experienced war themselves and became used to it. So to give you just one anecdote about how the unimaginable would become normal as young kids got used to this surroundings, the words of a doctor from Homs who described to me the experience of his own child. And he said, my son spent the first years of his life stuck inside because of the curfew and the bombing in Homs, where we lived. He had no contact with anyone but his parents and grandparents. He was 2 years old when he saw another child for the first time. He went up to him and touched his eyes. He thought that he was a doll. Another aspect of this kind of normalization is what some people would call a kind of immunity to shock. Syrians would again and again tell me, nothing can shock and surprise us anymore after all we've seen. So here, another fighter from the province of Idlib put it in these terms. He said, at first, 1 or 2 people were killed, then 20. Then it became normal. If we lost 50 people, we'd think, thank God it's only 50. It's been so long since I heard that someone died of natural causes. I can't sleep if there are no sounds of bombs or bullets. I feel like something is missing. There's so much more to say about this experience of civilians living under war, but I'll close here with another aspect of this kind of normalization of terror. I'm having trouble seeing. Oh, okay, he's got a bit confused. One final aspect of the normalization of terror, and that is in humor. There's been a tremendous amount of satire and jokes and humor from Facebook posts to videos to entire series that many Syrians trying to make sense of the tragedy and express the pain and loss through humor. So to give you just one sense of this grappling with this dark, bitter humor, what was accomplished for revolutionary Syrians, but at what price? I'll share the words of Shafiq, whose story appears in the book at quite length, but this, not in the book, is a posting that he wrote on Facebook, and he wrote one day, "The most important and beautiful thing about the revolution is that people rid themselves of the words, 'Hush, the walls have ears.'" To which his friend commented, "Yeah, it's true, but there are no more walls left anyway. Everything is gone." And I can see you guys are sharp because you anticipated that joke. So we've now passed through this arc: authoritarianism, protest, militarization, and war. The next stage of the story, as we all know, is that of displacement, of refugee flight, and exile. So given these conditions in Syria, it is no wonder, clearly, that millions of Syrians have fled or been forced to flee their homes. So just some sense of the numbers, which of course change daily, but this is what I was able to see as of this morning. Of Syria's pre-war population of approximately 22 million, some nearly 7 million are internally displaced. So these are people who've been forced to leave their homes but are still inside Syria, maybe living in schools with families, renting new apartments, but forced from their homes. Some 5.4 million are refugees in the countries surrounding Syria's borders, primarily in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, smaller numbers in Egypt, and some in Iraq. I always think when you are fleeing as a refugee to Iraq, that's when you know how bad your situation really is. Some over 1 million Syrians, or approximately 1 million Syrians, are currently in Europe seeking asylum or having received asylum. So that gives you some sense of the numbers, that over half of the population has been forcibly displaced. Just to give you some sense, at this point, the borders are largely closed, Syria's borders. Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, they say we're full, we don't want to allow any more Syrians in. There are small cases for those who are able to either bribe smugglers to get out of Syria, or emergency cases, but for the most part, no Syrians are getting out of Syria anymore. And some are even going back and returning to Syria. So there's an issue of the borders being closed for the major countries on Syria's border. Otherwise, to give you a sense of how these countries are grappling, the Zaatari refugee camp, which was established in Jordan in summer 2012, is currently the 4th largest town in Jordan. I visited Zaatari when it was just beginning, a few tents sort of hastily erected in the desert. It now has full-on urban planning, a population of some 80,000 Syrian refugees, streets, neighborhoods, a commercial district, all surrounded by barbed wire so the Syrians can't get out. But it's a bulging population in a country that is grappling with its own lack of water and resources and so forth. In Lebanon, a tiny country of some 4 million Lebanese citizen residents, approximately 1/4 of all residents of Lebanon are Syrian refugees. Imagine if 1 in 4 residents of the United States was a Syrian refugee. So this country is utterly grappling. The numbers have gone up and down a bit, but that's approximately it in the country of Lebanon. Turkey is the largest recipient of Syrian refugees, with some 3.4 million Syrian refugees. I spent quite a bit of time in Turkey. There is a full range of Syrians, from kids who are barefoot begging on the streets, to some Syrians who are merchants and have been doing quite well and are starting new enterprises and firms and sort of flourishing businesses. So you have from rich to poor, but everyone's situation is precarious. They don't know if they'll be given any sort of citizenship, legal residency, for how long they will be able to remain. Turkey treats Syrian refugees as guests. their legal status. So even from those who are doing terribly or better off economically, legally, socially, they remain in a state of limbo. So given this sort of broad sweep of the situation for the huge number of refugees on the countries on Syria's borders, we can also see why there's no wonder that many would try to make it to Europe. And that peak then happened in the summer of 2015 when we saw the sort of huge increased spike of Syrians and other refugees trying to get to Europe, the boats going across the Mediterranean, sometimes small rubber dinghies, many dying and drowning along the way, those who were lucky enough to get there walking through the Balkans, and so forth. Of course, by March 2016, the European Union signed an agreement with Turkey to largely end and close its borders and end the flow, giving Turkey a whole lot of money, essentially, in order for Turkey's promise to try to prevent refugees from getting to Europe. So that's the peak of it in Europe, and since then those numbers have declined. But still, countries like Germany and Sweden, especially, and others, accepting hundreds of thousands of Syrians. All of which puts in context the United States, which has to now accepted approximately 21,000 Syrian refugees since the conflict began in Syria in 2011. This is like a weekend in Munich in 2015, a neighborhood of Beirut, and so forth. So we can see really that we, relative to the rest of the world, given this huge refugee outflow, and of course Syrians are just one part of this massive refugee crisis, where we stand in it. So the stories that I've collected in the book talk more about the human experience of being a Syrian refugee, the journey itself, becoming a refugee, the challenges of being a refugee. There are many stories from Lebanon to Sweden, and they all emphasize that the struggle does not end once a person reaches a place of relative safety. Rather, it's just a new cycle of challenges that begin. So to express that, I'll share with you one excerpt from one of the few Syrian refugees or asylum seekers lucky enough to get to the United States. And this is in honor of the cold wave that we're having in much of the country, though not here. I'll read the words of Hadia, who is a Syrian refugee I met in Chicago, where she came to Chicago on a fellowship to study and has been able to remain. So here are Hadia's words. She said, 12 of us Fulbrighters from Syria came to the US in 2010. No one had any intention of staying. We were happy to have this opportunity and then go back home. And then the revolution began. I tried very, very hard to get all the details I could from my cousin and my brother who were in Damascus. I had this thirst to know, so I could pretend that I was living through their stories. At school, people kept telling me, at least you're safe. That word, safe, drove me crazy. I wanted to scream, you don't get it. This is a historic moment. I need to be there. My mom and brother both got visas to visit the US for my graduation. My mom was planning on staying only a month. But while she was here, the regime started bombing just minutes from our home in Damascus. We kept postponing her return ticket. We never thought that she'd stay this long. As Mom always says, she came with one suitcase and never said goodbye to people. Winter came, and I told my mom, let's go get you a coat. She said, I can't believe I'm going to go buy things while people are dying in Syria. I'd say, we have to. It's Chicago, and it's cold. She'd say, but I have all those coats in Syria. It's the small things like that. They become like rocks on your chest. You can't buy a sandwich without thinking, how much is the sandwich If this money were sent to Syria, then my role is different from people on the inside, but I need to do something. I have this responsibility to tell the story, to say what is happening on the other side of the world. The last part of the book is reflections, Syrians trying to make sense of this whole historic journey. And in making sense of what has happened, the Syrians I interviewed articulate pained reflections. These range from anger at what they see as the indifference of the international community, to nostalgia for a Syria that no longer exists, to a sense of existential instability before a profoundly unknown future. And this insecurity takes many forms. One is a kind of uncertainty, for some even an ambivalence about the rebellion itself, as there's awareness that the groups that are strongest on the ground today have agendas very different than the original civic goals of the uprising. Here, Maher puts it in these terms. He said, I went out, I was arrested, I worked, I demonstrated, and then ISIS comes along or some other group comes, and little by little they steer things in the wrong direction. You did all these things for the revolution, and you see that things are only getting worse. Fear of the regime was broken, but then there started to be fear of the revolution itself. Similarly, many express the sense of fear of and the awareness that the conflict is so penetrated by foreign state agendas. Here, a military defector put it in these terms. He said, many countries have interests in Syria, and they're all woven together like threads in a carpet. We don't know where this is leading. All we know is that we're everyone else's battlefield. All of this is heart-wrenching for all Syrians. And what I found is a special kind of heart-wrenchingness, that's a word, for activists, for those who went out into the streets and risked their lives to protest in 2011. And many continue to do tireless work inside Syria or from abroad in the fields of education, relief, medical and psychological support, education. They continue to work for this dream of a free Syria. But even as they do, many wrestle with a sense of guilt, maybe even regret, wondering if it was wrong to have ever protested. Here are the words of Marcel, an activist, when she told me, I belong to the revolution generation, and I'm proud of that. We tried our best to build something. We faced a lot, and we faced it alone. But we lost control. We don't know anymore what's useful. Most of us now are disappointed and depressed. I ask myself, are we a cause of all that's happened? Should we have done things differently? Should we have done nothing at all? Perhaps the greatest source of pain and loss and fear that I found among the Syrians that I've interviewed and continue to interview is not necessarily the sense of guilt and worry about their own selves. It's the worry about their loved ones, for their family members who are now scattered across continents, for those who are still in Syria in harm's way, and most of all, for those who've been arrested and disappeared. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians, and no one knows where they are. And families live day in and day out not knowing if their loved ones are alive or dead, waiting for words. And this came to me to the fore most powerfully in January 2014 with this revelation of tens of thousands of photographs evidencing systematic torture in the regime's prisons. And these were gotten out of the country, smuggled by a regime defector who goes by the name Caesar. So that's the explanation of the name Caesar on the bill that you guys have described on your postcards. Caesar is a defector who worked for the prison system of the Assad prisons. His job was to take pictures of the corpses of prisoners who had died. He collected tens of thousands of these and smuggled them out of the country. They've been analyzed by forensic experts. They've been shown on the floor of the Congress. They've been shown in the walls of the United Nations. And they show what is done, the torture, the systematic starvation in the regime prisons. So this is horrific on many, many levels. And here are people seeing it at the UN. But for Syrians, what does this feel like? Here to share the words of a Syrian friend and colleague of mine who wrote these words when these pictures first broke into the public awareness in January 2014. And he wrote, "The most difficult part of the torture pictures is not the decomposed flesh, the starved bodies, or even the knowledge that torture is both widespread and systematic. These things have always been elements of our Syrian reality. What is so difficult that I do not think that we have the strength to overcome is the fear that some of these pictures may show us the body of someone we know and we hope is still alive." What does all this mean? I'll close with the words of Adam from Latakia, trying to make sense of what all of this means from a Syrian point of view. Yeah, perfect, I'm on the right slide. So this is what he said, thinking back again to this whole historic arc. And Adam said, "One of the most profound things that I've learned from this experience, called the Syrian Civil War, is that there is no ultimate right or wrong. It's all shades of gray. The process of finding out what a country needs is never clean. Of course, when you're in a stable country with functioning institutions, it's easy to have a moral code. But these values are only possible because other people did dirty things to put that system in place. We opened a Pandora's box. We had this innocent, childlike interest to see what was inside the box. We thought we'd get a present, and what we got was all the evil in the world. Now we need to close the box again, but it's going to take a while. Now I'm working with an NGO that helps the free media inside Syria. I see my job as trying to support people who want to make their dreams come true. But I'm too old to dream now. In a month and a half, I'll be 29. So finally, in closing then, why listen to Syrian stories? Why collect testimonials? Why read them? Why study them? Just a few sort of closing ideas. One, I think that it is important because this is a way of documenting history. As we know, history can be studied with all sorts of different sources and materials, but the lived experience of history, ordinary people making history through their lives and experience, is an important way of trying to understand the past and thus understand the present. Two, as we know, Syria is often said to be one of the worst humanitarian crises of our times. There's a debate about what the US could have done or should have done. There are no easy solutions, but in debating them, I hope that we form opinions informed by empathy, never losing sight of the ordinary people whose lives have been transformed by violence. Thirdly, many displaced by the war in Syria are becoming new neighbors in countries across the world, and including in Southern California, where quite a few Syrian refugees have been resettled. To truly welcome them, it's necessary to learn who they are and what stories they carry with them. And there's no better way to understand, I think, the stories that they carry with them than to invite them to tell us. And finally, as we listen to Syrians' voices, I hope we come to approach the issue of Syrian refugees and Syrian refugees themselves, not with fear or with pity, but rather with respect. In the words of one woman from Aleppo, whose words are near the closing of the book, she said, "Every Syrian has 100 stories in his heart. Every Syrian is himself a story." Syrians have gone through a dangerous, painful, and courageous journey to be able to tell their own stories. The very least we can do is listen. I'll close there. Thank you very much.
What can you say? That leaves rocks on my chest. It really does. An incredible story of the human spirit. Okay, we will have a question and answer period, but don't start cracking me up down there. Let me say a couple of things. First, we have a wonderful group of people here. We're so glad we've got this many in attendance, which means please keep your questions to 1 minute, okay? I'm the watch person. You can say a lot in a minute. If you feel that you've just got more you've got to get out, let's just go have a beer and we'll talk about it. But we want to hear our speaker answer your questions, okay? So, and please wait for the microphone. Don't just get up and start talking. Alan will have the microphone. Everybody will get a turn. He will come around. If I find out that someone's just taking too long because he or she just has too much to say, I'm going to have to get up and give you a signal, okay? I don't mean to be rude, but I'm going to, pretend like I'm hanging or something. Just watch me. It means please just ask your question. Okay, thank you.
My question is, do you feel at some point the U.S. should have intervened?
I do. So, and there's a full range of opinions on this, but I was one of those who had the view that the U.S. should have intervened, that this is a regime that's shown that it will do whatever it needs to, whatever it can to stay in power and commit, that war crimes have been committed, crimes against humanity have been committed, and that there's nothing that would stop this regime otherwise. At the same time, the regime has strong intervention on its behalf. That this Assad regime would have collapsed were it not for the military, economic, political I don't think so, because this okay, I think this one is fine. I think of Iran, of Russia, of Hezbollah from Lebanon, even Iraqi forces on the ground. So I do think that the U.S. should have intervened. At the moment, doesn't necessarily mean troops on the ground. Even Syrians themselves who were begging for intervention were not calling for U.S. or any foreign troops. They were a whole range from bombing regime plane runways or planes on the ground, from a talk of a no-fly zone, which of course is a much more serious operation. But something to show to the Assad regime that it could not continue killing with such impunity. So, of course, the crisis moment of all of this was the whole red line issue of August, September 2013. And Syrians I talked to said that at that moment, most Syrians I talked to were begging for the U.S. to bomb. Even those who were inside the country, even those who were raised on this national sentiment to see the U.S. anti-imperialism and this and that, were wanting intervention because they saw that the military conflict was such that it would never. It was the only hope to be able to show the Assad regime that there are consequences for its crimes. So I was of the opinion, and of course there's a lot of different viewpoints, and the whole question of intervention was surrounded by uncertainty. My understanding of President Obama's position was, can anyone guarantee me that if we intervene, things will get better rather than worse? And that's, I think, a very high bar. There are lots of unknowns. Whatever we would do, who knows what Iran would do, who knows what would happen. That it's surrounded by uncertainty, and there were various calculations of contingency plans and estimations and so forth. So it would be a risky endeavor. It could not necessarily be a guaranteed endeavor, but I was one who erred on the side that some sort of action was necessary, and the consequences of inaction are as serious and as grave as the possible negative consequences of action. So I would not be surprised if many of you disagree, but that was my stance on it. Yeah.
Wendy, I don't want to ask you a political or diplomatic or academic question. I want to ask you about your own emotional reaction in doing this. And that's based on my reaction to your secondhand account of this, which is very, very emotional, and brought me back to demonstrations where we were safe because we were in the US with the Bill of Rights, and the nearest we came to being hurt was in Grant Park and Michigan Avenue in Chicago, the Dem Convention, we were attacked by police. But how could you and did you retain your distance and your analytic and academic ability, or did this get to you, and did this get you to break down at all, ever, how often?
Thank you so much. Absolutely it did. I mean, I think I began in 2012, and there was still a tremendous amount of optimism. I would talk to Syrians, and they still felt hope and felt like they were still kind of on fire with the liberating euphoria of having protested, and some sense that victory would be near, and really a lot of faith still in the international community that might come to their side. By 2013, that mood had totally changed among Syrians, and you could see the sort of depression settling in. So just imagine where people are now, by now 2018. So my second interviewing trip was about 2.5 months in Turkey and Jordan in 2013, and I came back to that quite rattled. I think that the time when I was doing interviews, I had the sense of I had to sort of shovel in and gather as much material as I could. I only had a finite amount of time. I wanted to gather, and wasn't really processing it at the time. Then I came back to the United States and felt like a truck had hit me. And then it hit me, oh my goodness, what have I collected? Because I collected stories of former prisoners talking about being tortured in prison, of people who lost family members, and just the sheer sort of despair. So yeah, it really did hit me, and what I needed to do was put the project aside for several months. I just couldn't work with it day to day. I put it aside. In 3 months, I worked on something else, and that after time gave me a little bit more distance to come back to it. Because I also had a project, I had a mission. I had the sort of privilege to go and travel, to speak the language, to collect these stories, so I could sort of entrusted with a mission to put them forward. So I was both emotionally rattled, but I also had to kind of get it together because I wanted to see the project through to fruition. So at some point I had to take a break to get my own emotional distance. And it was years later I had a conversation with a woman who was translating a book about the Holocaust. And she told me, you know, in order to do this kind of work, she said what she's discovered is that you look for some kind of a sweet spot. If you're too emotionally attached, if you're too emotionally vulnerable, you can't work. You're overwhelmed by the pain. But if you're too detached, then you also are losing the sense of the emotion. It comes to be words on page and not real people's lives. And the trick is to find some kind of a middle ground where you're connected enough to have the sensitivity and empathy, but distance enough to be able to do your work. So I think that over time I've been able to find that spot, but I didn't have a strategy or a clear vision. I kind of stumbled through by going one or the other. And I still think I tip maybe from one to the other at some times, but at least there's a sense that that is the place where you're able to do the most service to a mission of communicating this on to others, but never losing sight of it. Yeah.
Wendy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Wendy, thanks for the book and thanks for tonight. My question, isn't it true that the Alawites are a minority
Yes.
in the country? And what was the role of sectarianism in the uprising and what followed?
Thank you. It's a really terrific and super complicated question. So Bashar al-Assad is a family that comes from a religious minority called the Alawite religious minority. Syria is maybe, there aren't firm statistics, but the census is maybe 65 to 70% Sunni Muslim, and the remainder is a sort of hodgepodge of different religious minorities. The Alawite minority, Christians, Druze, a small Shia population, and other religious minorities. So the Assads are the Alawites, and they have traditionally I mean, the Alawites is a religious minority that is seen as traditionally persecuted. It suffered both political persecution and economic marginalization under the Ottoman times, when Syria was an Ottoman part of the Ottoman Empire. The Alawites began to move into the army in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and also became quite a group quite adherent to the Ba'ath Party, the current regime's ruling party, in part because the Ba'ath Party's ideology was secular and nationalist, so it especially appealed to religious minorities as opposed to an ideology that had a stronger place for Islam per se. So non-Sunni Muslim minorities were attracted to the Ba'ath Party. So Hafiz al-Assad then comes to power, and from then, some of the leading members of the regime were also people from his own religious sect. He put them in power as loyalists he could trust, and also the strongest positions of the security forces, those who you really need to rely upon, who would use military force against citizens as necessary, tend to be people from his own religious sect. At the same time, the regime created cross-sectarian allies. There are many, many Sunni Muslims who are also regime loyalists, and there are some Alawites who are in the opposition. The regime was smart enough to know you couldn't rule by 12 or 15% of the population alone, so made alliances, especially with Sunni Muslim businessmen. You are able to make money in exchange for your loyalty and so forth. So there is, especially the Sunni Muslim business class, people who felt like they had a lot to lose with a current situation overthrown, have absolutely stood by the regime as well. So the sectarian issue is complicated, but the fact that most of those who went out into the uprising tended to be Sunni Muslim, because that's the majority of the population in general, people who felt like they got the least out of this regime. Now, there are a lot of Alawites who also didn't get much out of this regime as well, who still remained poor and marginalized, not among those elites who got high positions. But the regime has also been able to use this rhetoric that there's an angry sort of Muslim majority, that if they were to overthrow this regime, they would wreak havoc and revenge against the religious minorities who seem to have maybe gotten too large a piece of the pie. It has used that rhetoric in order to scare religious minorities to hold tight to the regime, saying that these kids on the streets are terrorists, they're Salafis, they're Muslim radicals, they're funded by Saudi Arabia, they're Al-Qaeda. If this uprising comes, it will destroy the secular nationalist nature of the Syrian system, and religious minorities, you guys are going to have huge violence against you. So sectarianism, I would say, many Syrians at the same time, that's kind of a roundabout answer because it's such a complex question. One thing that's always struck me when I've talked to Syrians is how proud they are of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious coexistence that Syria has traditionally been a part of the Syrian tradition. Syrians again and again would tell me things like, we didn't even know what religion our neighbors were or our classmates were. We didn't talk about it. It was all fine. So this kind of a sectarian hatred, to the degree it's been fired up now, in many ways I would say, is the effect of violence and so much bloodshed, rather than being the cause of violence in the first place. And the first protest, people went to pains to say, this isn't about sectarianism, it isn't about religion, we aren't against the Alawites or against the Christians. We want to live without fear, we want rule of law, we want accountability, we want elections, we want political parties, we want a democracy to choose our own rights. But as time has gone on, and there's been so much bloodshed, and people that identify with the uprising can look and say, the security force commanders are all Alawite. And some of the people who were first on the street to fight in the name of the regime were Alawite loyalists. They look and see the person who killed me, or my neighbor, is Alawite. The Alawites at the same time say, look, see, there is Al-Qaeda and there's ISIS, and there are a bunch of radicals who deny our existence. With more and more blood, it's become more and more sectarianized. So I always think of sectarianization rather than sectarianism per se. I think of sectarianization as a verb, not a noun. It's not a thing that motivates. It's a process that comes about, that changes over time, and has been fueled by the violence and the bloodshed and the despair and the anger more than it was a cause of that in the first place. There's a lot more to say about that, and that gives you some sense of where I come at it.
Where do you see the UN?
Embarrassingly weak. Embarrassingly weak. I mean, there have been series of UN security resolutions that Russia has vetoed, or sometimes Russia and China has vetoed. So it's been interesting to see almost a string of high-ranking UN officials who've resigned, so frustrated that the body has been able to do so little. And not just on the political front for stopping violence, but even on the humanitarian front. So even the humanitarian front, as far as refugees and so forth, is just, dealing with the symptoms of the cause, which is the war. In order for the UN to do work and offer aid and distribute aid inside Syria, it has to do it with the agreement and authorization of the Assad government, because it's still a constituted, recognized government, and the UN recognizes the sovereignty of member states. So for the UN to distribute aid inside Syria or to evacuate besieged towns that are being surrounded and starved, it can only get in and distribute aid or do any kind of work as the Assad regime allows it to. And there have been great investigative exposés that the Assad it allows the UN in, has done so contracting with its own cronies for humanitarian food and so forth, so that even a lot of UN money indirectly goes to supporting sort of the regime cronies. So I think the UN's role in this has been extremely disappointing, and I think that many in the UN are similarly frustrated with its inability to do much, especially given that the core of the crisis is political. And the UN is limited by the political will of its member states.
Yeah, do you think, this is a hypothetical question, but if the U.S. had not gone into Iraq in 2003, do you think the Arab Spring and all of this other stuff in Syria and all over would have still transpired?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly unpredictable. I mean, protests and uprisings are just so unpredictable. A week ago, nobody would say there would be protests in Iran, and now all of a sudden we're thinking, oh my gosh, what's... So I think revolutions are just tremendously unpredictable in general, but I'm not of the opinion that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was an important stepping stone at all in the Arab Spring. I see it very much domestic, that these authoritarian regimes, populist regimes came to power in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They made huge promises about bringing freedom and bread and social justice and employment, and those regimes failed. They failed in the 80s, by the 90s, by the 2000s. A new generation of especially university-educated kids who couldn't get jobs, plus social media and the ability to circumvent regime censorship by spreading information. I think it was waiting for a spark for a long time. And there were riots in the 80s that were able to sort of be tamped down by some cosmetic reforms in countries across the Arab world. And there were simply no more cosmetic reforms anymore. So it began in a spontaneous way and spread. But I see the causes and the drivers of being quite domestic. It's the citizens reacting to the failures of their own regime. Any U.S. rhetoric about freedom or democracy didn't, I think, really play any role whatsoever. Social media might have, the sheer technology of being able to share information. Please.
When it comes to revolution,
Yeah.
Wait, TV needs,
my life is very
Yeah, I hear you, but yeah.
TV needs.
When it comes to revolution, we've seen through the Arab Spring many uprisings, etc. And they've pretty much all failed.
Yes.
And the reason that they failed is probably because there was no central political core that then could take over. How do you feel about, for instance, the Iranian revolution or Iranian uprising that's going on? Is it worth doing? Is it worth having a revolution when there's nothing to replace the people that you're trying to get rid of?
Yeah, no, it's a really tough question, and I spend this time talking to Syrians, and many of them who sacrificed so so much for the cause of revolution themselves ask this question, should we never have done it? And some say, had we known it would lead to such tremendous destruction, we wouldn't have. And there are Egyptians who say, look, our country is more authoritarian now than under Mubarak, we ousted in 2011. I mean, Tunisia is sort of the bright part of the Arab Spring that seems to have made a successful transition and consolidation to democracy, but even there are many Tunisians who went out especially aggravated by economic grievances, say we're still as poor and unemployed and hungry as we were. What good has this democracy given us, really? So it's a tremendously bleak question, and I think that, you know, as someone who studies the Middle East, I see the differences of the different countries, that they have different paths, different institutional strengths and weaknesses, different foreign interventions and foreign alliances that shaped their path. So I'm sort of don't generalize as much as I can look at each country and why it happened, why things unfolded the way it did. I think, for example, in the case of Syria, wasn't that there was an uprising and it toppled a regime and there was nothing there. It was because people went out against a regime that from the very first moment was prepared to destroy the entire country rather than give up power. I mean, the slogan used by Assad loyalists from the very first weeks was a slogan in Arabic that said, Assad or we'll burn down the country. In 7 years, that's what they've done. So it was the kind of the ruthlessness of those in power willing to do whatever you needed to stay in power that I think has led to the absolute horrific situation there. You know, in Libya, it's a slightly, I think, different story. Gaddafi was overthrown, but Libya was a historically weak state. So when it was just, Gaddafi had centralized so much power in his person that when he left, there was a total vacuum. And that is what Libya is now. So each country has the different reasons that it ended in kind of a catastrophe, but I think your question points to that so many are now in catastrophic situations. So my understanding of the situation in Iran today is, although there are some slogans that sort of say regime change, for the most part these are being fueled by economic grievances, by some call for political reform, that it is a series of a tremendous amount of emotional anger and disappointment, but it's something that could be met by economic reforms, cracking down on corruption. The people who feel like they've lost out and don't have jobs and don't have bread, and that this could be, many of their grievances can be met without a total overhaul of the Islamic Republic. And if the Islamic Republic is smart, it will make those reforms not simply demonize protesters, but realize that some of their grievances are legitimate. Which is, sort of also takes us back to Syria. I absolutely think that could have been done in Syria too. I mean, Syrians tell me again and again, when we first went out to the streets, we were calling for something like repeal of the emergency law, which had been in power since 1963, that Syria was technically in a state of emergency, that allowed security forces to arrest anybody without trial or charge. They were saying maybe repeal that part of the Constitution that says the Ba'ath Party will always be the ruling party of state and allow some real competition. And what they would say to me is, had Bashar al-Assad made those changes, we would have cheered him as a great ruler. So I think that it's also a question of those rulers who are facing pressure, if they make the choice of offering some meaningful concessions, or they take the path of, we will accept no protest. Give an inch and people will take a foot, and we need to show our people that we're not weak, that force is the only language these population understands, and we need to crush them. That was the path that was taken in Syria. It didn't need to be a war, no less a catastrophic war. So I think there's lots of subtleties along the way to see how, had different choices been taken, the outcome didn't need to necessarily, it's not necessarily authoritarianism in total silence or total chaos, that there could be paths along the way if those who had power used it more wisely and more magnanimously toward the populations.
That's going to be the last question we have tonight, because we have to give people an opportunity to buy the book. It'll be right over here. Anybody who wants it, come right up, and I'm sure that you will sign it also.
So once So it's the least price I can give, and I'd be happy to sign them. If not, they're available on Amazon and elsewhere.